Osrith, he declared, as Elfkin slipped from the saddle and, looking around as more men came to surround Slipna, helped her down too. "You look awful." "Your men," Osrith declared, as Aldhelm paced next to her, listening. "Move them, they should stand with the Wessex army. There will be a shield wall when the Danes come." Her words were ragged as she spoke to the mercenary general, and he paused, making sure she had a chance to say everything she wanted to him. "We saw there was a fire," Aldhelm declared, after listened to the rest of her story. But, when she came to Ethelfled, Aldhelm shook his head. "No, no," he disclaimed. "Neither the lady, nor the Lord Utard have been here." He looked around his commanders, who had joined the shouting that a raider was attacking. Each declared that they had not seen the lady, not the Lord Untard return to them. Osrith's heart, which, until now, was buoyant with optimism, started to chill. He had not brought Ethelfled back, or, he could be, now, allowing her to flee East Anglia, Britain. In any case, "Assemble," Aldhelm ordered. When no other information was provided, he turned his head to the men, and looked for their captains. "Commanders, get your men." We assembled. But then he broke away. To the left of Ethliad, for whom Aldhelm spoke, stood the King of Wessex. Osrith looked at his face, poker straight, emotionless. Had he heard her say about Ethelfled? If she had gone with Utard, did he wonder where she was? Or was Alfred the great king? Osrith suspected, and knew where his bonded man was. And behind them, as a rhythmic thump of enemy boots could be heard, horses, and they all turned to see, sitting before Utard, Daneslayer, the daughter of the king. "Place a guard around my daughter," ordered Alfred, when she had slipped from the saddle. "Father, I can fight," she declared, but Alfred merely gave her a look, and said nothing to her, but urged the guards on, of which one was Alfred. Osrith felt dampness on her face and realized it had begun to rain, and she, still clad as a Dane, moved to position in the shield wall that was assembling, kneeling in the second row at the most dangerous spot, the center of the line. At last, Osrith would be in battle, and would have no chance to turn when men either side of her lost control of their bladders and their bowels, slipping on guts freed from stomachs by the Norsemen and Danes, in the honorable tradition of respect, from Eric Thurgilson. Chancing a glance behind her, Osrith saw that Ethelfled, still surrounded by men, had something clutched in her hand. Was it the dagger Osrith had given her? She really hoped so. Guards were as vulnerable as any other soldier when a battle began, more so if the guards were taken out. Could she have the presence of mind to use the weapon? Could she take a Seeksor sword and save her own life? And it began. Osrith crouched behind West Saxons who were inhabiting the front line, and she thought she recognized Odda's men, although the rain was getting more intense and was dripping into her eyes. As well as blood, mud would cause the lines to slip, and Osrith ground her boots as far down into the ground as she could, to give herself as much grip as she could when the line was leaned on. It didn't take long, and although they were fewer in number, and mostly inebriated, the Norse, led by Siegfried, and the Danes captained by Hestin, had broken down parts of the shield wall, trying to break the armies into discrete groups that would be easier to fight. They were far more ferocious, fighting for their lost honor promised by the Thurgilsons, of wealth and land, the gaining of which was now much further away from their grasp. Osrith's section had been driven back, and were fighting against a dozen men, Rorik one of them, she noticed, and realized that a lot of the men were youngsters, having used their agility and youthful energy to push them away. But they were unwise in tactics, so Osrith called to the West Saxons and Mercians, who were holding their own, that they should form an arrow shape, a swineshed, with which to break them apart. She placed herself next to Elfgar, who clapped her on the shoulder and relayed this to the 3 men of her division who were with them and West Saxons she did not know. Falkberg instantly clicked into position near the front, undercutting the first 2 youngsters as Oshir took on 2 more with Egelwulf. Elfkin, she could not see, neither Leofstan. Osrith could see that Miral was fighting furiously on his own against 2 of Hestin's men, and she inched herself back towards Ethelfled, who was holding the dagger in both hands, clutched to her chest. But it looked to Osrith that she was unafraid of the battle, and was, instead, reading the land, reading the men, their positions, their actions. Behind her, 3 more West Saxons slipped into the swineshed position, and the whole little company were doing their utmost to hammer the Danes and Norse away, those youths, though energetic, meeting their demise through strategy and tactics of the Saxons' positions. And then she saw Miraal stumble. 2 Danes were upon him as he slipped in the mud, but Osrith had seen and had come in next to them, hammering one in the neck with her seeks, before turning on the other. It was Hestin. He paused in his fying, however, to turn to Miraal, who was now, back in the mud, struggling backwards, to try to get an advantage. Why wasn't he attacking her, Osrith thought, as Hestin raised his axe to Miraal. Then, the moonlight glinted off her Thor's hammer. He hadn't recognized her. This was an advantage, and it sunk into her mind as she threw herself at Hestin, just as the blow was about to land on her commander, knocking the Dane into the mud. Around them, other Danes assumed Osrith was on her side. One even helped her up, as she thrust down Tagd's seeks into his calf. He screamed, and rolled in the mud, but the Dane who had helped her up was now sword to sword with a pair of West Saxons. Miraal had his feet now, and had now engaged with 2 Norse. Osrith looked to the swineshed. It was holding against more Danes. She made to go to join them, to fill in a gap on the left flank. Behind Miraal, Ethelfled had found herself a sword, and was fighting alongside Uthed, who was parrying Dane and Norse with Ethelfled by his side. And then she struck Siegfried, who was coming towards them. His daggered hand towards Ethelfled suddenly stopped. The Lady of the Mercens had driven Uthed's sword through his chest. Osrith turned, and it was Tagd, running towards the Norse, holding his sword aloft. He would need his seeks, Osrith thought, wondering vaguely where Elfkin was, that she could get it back for him as she became there, by his side, as one of Siegfried's men was about to deliver a fatal strike. He staggered backwards, but not from injury. Instead, Finan, not Tagd, circled his sword around in a wide arc and pushed the metal blade through the back of another Norse warrior who was coming into his left, before turning to Osrith. Or, where Osrith had been. She was now at the back of the disintegrated shield wall, holding together a thin like with Elfrith and 2 other warriors. Aldhelm was at his side as the Wessexman that Odda had raised, from his lands in Devonshire, fought with more ferocity and skill than ever could be attributed to Shawls, men who she had passed, no doubt, all of those months ago, when she had rode with Odda's guard through the very west of West Saxon territory. A terrible roar of men meeting men arose to their left, but Osrith was unperturbed, and continued to meet Siegfried's men, shouting at them in Norse that their gods were a fallacy and that Odin had damned them. And some time later a shout went up, which was someone for the West Saxons calling a retreat. Another called the Mercens. Osrith turned to go, and then turned to meet a blade. It was Finan. He saw her Thor's hammer, and what had saved her when she had gone to help Miraal was now her disadvantage. She swung, trying to dislodge Soul Stealer from its position, but Finan bore down on her, grinning madly. She was a Dane to him, Osrith knew, and she held on to Bué with all her might, pushing him back with her left hand against his shoulder, the wailing, keening yell curdling in her throat. Then drew Bué away. Finan stumbled forward, keeping his feet, and Osrith swung in a different direction. For he had not seen Hestin the Dane, who had managed to stagger upright, thrust towards Finan, and she twisted, unbalancing him, and stepped over the man, running towards the Mercens. It took some time for the battle sounds to ebb away, for the Northmen to be called away by Hestin, who had now inherited a good deal of wealth from the dead Thurgilson brothers. Wessex and Mercen men began to gather the dead, gather weapons and anything salvageable, which would please both Stipa and Miraal, who would reuse, and get reforged, anything they could. Osrith made her way, injured, but alive, in the direction of the majority of the Mercens, vowing to help when she had gathered her breath. She surveyed the battlefield. Morning was on its way, and with it, the springtime sun would sneakily expose the killing of the night, like a child telling tales to a parent. In the end, There had not been enough Danes to match the Mersons and West Saxons, and the victory was settled. When Osrith found her men, she was deeply happy to account for all 5 of them, but Elfgar's stand-in as he replaced Osrith, who had a slice from a sharp sword down his body. Leofstan had lost a lot of blood, but was still able to limp off the field with her division. Elfgar was dead. She found Elfrith pulling his friend's cloak around his shoulders, and Osrith got to her feet and stepped towards her comrade to help him. A man blocked the sunlight, casting a shadow over her. "Ante Inanagam," Finan said to her, his face covered in blood. His eyes were earnestly searching her own face, and Osrith put her hand to her cheek. "Don't tell me, I got a bit of blood on me." "Nothing that the Thames over there won't get off," he replied. She made to step past him, but Finan stood in her way. Osrith met the Irishman's eyes made to turn, but she found a hand closed around her left wrist. "You turned from me, in the hall," she accused, trying to get free. But Finan had her fast. Out of the corner of her eye she saw Elfrith stiffen as he watched them. "I heard you shout Taine and I saw your palm." As a dying Dane let out a death groan, Osrith unfolded her left hand and looked at it. "The scar? Is that what he meant?" She had never exchanged more than a score of words with the man, not been in his company more than half a dozen times, yet he had noticed her hand. What else had he noticed? Breathing deeply, she shook her hand from him again, and he let go. Osrith loosed Bue's hilt and looked up to him. "You saved my life in the river, Finan Narnalaid." Morantain, Osrith Narn Mercia," Finan replied, nodding towards Hestin, who was stumbling towards fleeing Northmen. It was good to see his astonishment when she replied, "Sc Urbetha." "My thanks," he repeated, in English. Then, turning a little, his eye searching for Utad, added, "Toilectolas a "And you, Finan More," she replied, then turned herself and strode over to where Elfrith was beginning to bind the wrapped body of Elfgar. Finan More. Finan the mighty. Mighty in strength, mighty-hearted, like all the Irishmen she had known. Yet, with a cleft of sadness running through him which only service to her brother would mend, it would seem. She helped Elfrith lift Elfgar onto one of the wooden carts painted in green and gold, the colours of Mercia, where it would make its way back to Aylesbury for burial. He had done his duty, Osrith had done hers, as had Elfrith and Miral and Ethliad, who was still staring at the blood-soaked figure of his wife, who was now being shrouded with a blanket and escorted from the field. Ethliad knew the measure of her now. She was Alfred's daughter, and, if he had ever thought that the equilibrium of power between Wessex and Mercia was shifting in Mercia's favour after his wedding, it was baldly clear that it was not. He would have to carry out expansionism of his own, to at least show Alfred he had not capitulated. For, capitulation would show some in Mercia he was not fit to rule the kingdom, and the result would be weakness, as a civil war ensued. Far better to unite Mercia in something which went to the heart of all Mercians, and excluded the West Saxons. Osrith suspected she knew exactly what he could do, and to whose mind she could plant the suggestion. As the Mercian army crossed the Thames into East Anglia, and the Fleet River, into their own kingdom, Osrith watched, sadly, as the army of Wessex trailed southwest. Odda, her former lord, was with them. She knew that he would be tried for treason, even if his foresight and action had saved the kingdom. Alfred could not overlook it. It would surely pain him to execute his friend. A weight, like a cold block of ice, formed in her stomach, and Osrith blinked her eyes to arrest the tears. "Miral says Aldhelm wishes to speak to you." Good, thought Osrith. She wished to speak to him, too. But it was Ethliad who had summoned her, and, at their camp that night, she stood before the Lord of Mercia. But it was the Lady of the Mercians who called Osrith to them. Battle-injured, Osrith noiced Ethelfled had a look about her, as if an internal calm had steadied her. "Build on the rock," St. Peter had said, "a firm foundation." And by the look of Ethelfled, her bedrock was granite. "I will be returning to Aylesbury, my wife," Ethliad continued, casting a strange look to Ethelfled, one of concern, no one of uncertainty. "I have granted her, for her bravery, further estates to add to those gifted when we were married. So, in Saltwick. She will need no more guard. There was a pause. She was surely not going to be dismissed, having fought so well. Osrith felt the weight of eyes upon her, her own men, Miral, who was supporting himself with a stick. Aldhelm was beside Ethliad, and was giving Osrith his usual peering frown. "You went, of your own accord, to the aid of my wife?" Ethliad said. "You have fought, spilled blood, put yourself in danger for her, for us." Ethliad rose to his feet. "Osrith Lackland, you have honored the kingdom of Mercia. And so, in recognition for your bravery and courage, I would have you and your men transferred to Wessex." "No, not there," Osrith thought, desperately. "If I fought so well for you, can I not return to Aylesbury? I am keeping guard for my own protection, at Winchester, and I want the best, your men, Lord Elfgar's men." Osrith smiled. Her friend had got back his title and presumably his lands, if posthumously, to remain in King Alfred's realm to protect my interests. "I am sending you Aldhelm," he added, gesturing to his counselor, "who is most in debt to you, for you saved his life." A cheer arose, as Osrith's mind turned to Aldhelm. She did not remember saving his life. "But, now, Wessex again?" "I will murder Ethelwold for you," Elfrith hissed, as Ethliad dismissed her, and waved forward Miral. "But keep your temper, for heaven's sake." Osrith smiled at him, as she thought of Elfgar. His death left a big hole in her army. Osrith had come to rely on his advice, and they worked well to execute strategy with the men. So, Wessex it was going to be. Osrith had not been able to retrieve her silver in the stables, and she wondered if it was still there. "Is there a restriction on where I stay?" Osrith asked Aldhelm, later, as he briefed her on her duties. "Your men must stay at the palace. If you feel it more suitable for you yourself to live outside the palace, and you relinquish your duties suitably, then this will be acceptable." Aldhelm put a hand on her back. "Look, it won't be half so dangerous as on a battlefield. The Lord Ethliad is paying you a great honor." But Osrith's ease was not to do with herself, or rather, not altogether. At least she didn't have to live at the palace. Instead, it was for Ethliad. He looked pale, distracted, a lord, king in the but name, haunted by the very offensive he wished to pull off himself that was being pulled off by the shrewd, cunning, intelligent king of Wessex. But there would be advantages. She would be able to see if her brother had more silver for her to steal, for one, and she now had captaincy and battle experience. Ethliad was in her debt for saving the honor of Mercia, or at least contributing to it. Best of all, King Alfred could not remove her from her position, for she was there under Ethliad's direction. "Are you pleased to be going south?" Elfrith asked, as the men prepared to leave. They were pleased to be honored by Lord Ethliad, too, and knew Winchester to be a rich, easy land. It was saved, Osrith thought. "I'm pleased. I am a captain and command men. I am representing the Lord of Mercia. And, I have unfinished business," she added, silently. Elfrith left soon after. He would be joining them when he had collected his wife from Aylesbury, and was marching with the mercenaries back for this task. Ethel was going to be pleased, he told Osrith, for she had left behind many friends there. But, she was surprised when, as her men were about to leave to catch up with the West Saxon army, when she was approached by a priest. Bickel had touched her arm and surprised her, but she had smiled when she saw him, and Thyra, who spoke to her. "You are to be in Wessex again," said the Danish woman. "Visitors, please Edra." And Osrith found herself nodding, as she extracted a seeks dear to her from the hands of her youngest soldier. Elfkin relinquished it without question, for Osrith had already rewarded him one better than he had before. "I agree," Osrith nodded, answering in Danish, and she saw Bickel look over to his wife for confirmation, a slight look at surprise in his eye as they left. Be surprised, Osrith thought, as he helped his wife onto his sable horse, heading towards the river. And, as they began to march themselves, Osrith thought that she knew the best thing about not being in Mercia: she would not have to see the Lady Ethelflaed ever again.